Namaste Poker Homies, it's Navinat on No Limit Hold'em. I'm going to do something a little different today and maybe for a while or sporadically off and on. So I've decided to do a new thing where I'm going to allow you guys and other students and past students and present students to send me questions and or hand examples, whatever you'd like, and then I will go over your like maybe it's in, I don't know, 30 minutes of your playing heads up against some opponent, or a description of a villain you'd like to know how to beat, or an overall question about game theory, or a hand that didn't make sense to you, or something that somebody just, it's going to be like customized to you videos. It's going to be at least an hour. Maybe I'll do like an hour and a half video, or probably we'll do some different structures, different types, because I would also like to give you the option to do, like to ask a question or give me a hand history or a database to look through, something like that. And then the very least expensive option might be for me to go over the stuff and then answer the question in video form, but publish that video without your name or anything, but publish that video on YouTube. So that way I'm using it as content, and so that helps me out, so I don't have to charge very much for it. But I digress. We'll get to the pricing and the idea that I have for this at the end of the video, but this is the first thing like this that I've done. And this comes from a guy who was a student, kind of still is, like he just pops in every once in a while. He's a very serious poker player. He plays live MTTs. He was just in Las Vegas not too long ago, and well, I digress. So he was asking me about this specific hand. He didn't play this hand, and I didn't play this hand, but this was a hand that he heard somebody talking about, and he sent in this question, and so I'm going to try to answer it in video form. So this is something like what I would do for you if you asked me a hand history and wanted to have one of these customized videos done, and I could do like an hour or an hour and a half and send it to you privately, or keep it something like 30-45 minutes and publish it on the YouTube channel. Okay, so the these first two players, they folded. I just kind of, the timing on this thing is a little bit tricky, so but they don't matter anyway. So the question was something like this. It was like, okay, so Navinat, if or well, actually, so Donovan, this hand came up, and I heard somebody who I respect talk about this hand, but it seemed to not work with the way that you, being me, Navinat, Donovan, describe poker situations. So is this a difference of approach? Are there, basically he was confused as to why this guy said to do this thing, but I say normally to do some other thing. Who's right, who's wrong? Does it depend? And if so, what does it depend on? Okay, so without further ado, both these guys fold. This I tried to put this in. This replayer does it. Well, it's $50. It's cash game. It's online, 25-cent 50, NL50, and it's I don't remember what site it's on, but it's not on a U.S. facing site. It's like PokerStars probably. And we have a little bit of a read on this guy. We think villain, the main villain in the hand, or the guy that's going to be the main villain in the hand, is probably a decent player. We're guessing he's a winning player. We know he's at least reasonably aggressive. So he's not a net. He's at least a tag, and at least in late position, versus like late position we expect that he's going to be pretty laggy, at least in this spot. We also think that the guy that's in the big blind is a good reg, and we think he's probably fairly aggressive also, which, I mean, if he's a good reg, he almost by definition is going to be fairly aggressive. So I think that sets it up. We don't have a lot of hands on these guys, but we've got like a decent sort of sense of how they're playing, and we have been about break even. We were up and then down and then reloaded and then up and down, but we're, we probably don't have an image as a winning or losing player. We probably just look like kind of a regular. Okay, so under the gun folds, under the gun +1 folds, 8 folds, and villain opens. Okay, So villain opens to 3 times the big blind, and this is the first decision point. We have pocket eights in the small blind with a good, probably aggressive player in the big blind. What do? Okay, so probably this was the first place that this student thought that I would do something different than what this hand, well, than what happens in this hand and what was kind of advocated in this hand. But it actually isn't different than what I'd advocate. I do normally, when facing aggression, we want to have polarized aggressive ranges, like polarized 3-betting ranges. And pocket eights might just barely make it if we were polarizing a range that it might be one of the value hands that we decide to use against exactly the button. I think that could make sense if for some reason we wanted to polarize versus the dealer button. But in the small blind, we have to be careful about flat calling. We want to have very few hands, if any hands, that flat call in a lot of situations. And this is kind of the exact situation where we don't want to have a flatting range in the small blind, because when we flat here versus a wide button range, it means our range is capped. We probably don't have a very strong range, and that makes this guy too able to squeeze us out of the pot. So if we were to call this 60 cents, if this guy's a good thinking rag, especially if he's kind of aggressive, he's going to know that this is a very good spot to make a big squeeze raise, knowing that he will likely knock me out and have a pretty good chance of just taking the blinds down. But even if he doesn't, he creates dead money and gives himself a chance to play heads up with an uncapped range against capped ranges. So it can be a really bad situation for us. And if we're going to try to have a flatting range that would include a hand as strong as eights here, then we'd have to also have some traps, and I don't want to have traps. I don't want to like flat pocket aces against the button when we're 100 big blinds deep. I don't like that. I think it's a bad idea. So we'd have to have those traps, though. We'd have to like flat aces, flat kings, like flat, I don't know, some hands like pocket eights and even pocket twos to have a back raising range, and all this just nightmarish like nonsense. Now if we're playing against a player that is going to just 4-bet or fold, if the villain is just never, if the button opener is just never going to flat us, then I think we can think a lot more seriously about having a polarized and kind of, polarized 3-betting range. But even at that, like, we have to pay attention to the guy that's behind us. So even though polarized aggression is what you want to do when you can get away with it, it's the most efficient way to use your range when you have the ability to do so. It isn't always the case that you can do so. So for that reason, like for the reasons of having a good thinking player here and a good thinking player here that are both kind of aggressive, we're in the small blind. If we flat, the best case scenario is we have to play an uncapped range out of position against 1 or 2 players. We invite this guy to come in with a good price. Even worse, we give him a great opportunity to go for a squeeze, then we're not going to know what in the hell to do. Well, like, if he squeezes and he folds, do we call? Do we back raise? Do we fold? Who knows? I don't know. So let's just try not to put ourselves in that situation, and let's 3-bet. Now, even if this guy's going to play 4-bet or fold, eights are a perfectly good 3-bet still. Like, even if we were going to polarize our range, I think we could still throw this into the polarized range. And then depending on how his 4-bet fold stat looks, or how often we expect him to be bluff 3-betting or bluff 4-betting. So depending on how often he folds versus a 5-bet, and depending on how often he 4-bets as a bluff, and we may decide if he 4-bets to flat pocket eights, or to fold pocket eights, or to jam pocket eights. But I could definitely see them making their way into a polarized 3-bet range. So especially like if we plan on flatting any 4-bets, then I think pocket eights would be a good hand to 3-bet. But even if we don't plan on flatting any, which probably we wouldn't, they can still make a fine jam. I mean, if you jam as a 5-bet and you expect your opponent's only going to call with like ace, king, and like pocket jacks plus, if he's going to fold basically everything else, then your pocket eights might as well be pocket tens. I mean, you could, or if the guy's only going to jam queens plus ace king, then you may as well say they're pocket jacks. They become pocket jacks, right? Because
they're going to have the same equity against that range. Like if my opponent has jacks plus an ace king, or jacks plus an ace king and ace queen, it doesn't matter if I have pocket eights, pocket twos, pocket tens. It just they're all just one pair against either a bigger pair or overcards. So yeah, and if we're not gonna have a flatting range, we're not gonna fold pocket eights. So that means we just 3-bet. The hand plays better heads up anyway, especially at this depth. Plus, so we want to knock this guy out. Don't give him the opportunity to squeeze. Don't make it easy for him to come into our pot and play 3 ways where we're monkey in the middle. Where we're actually playing out of position against 2 opponents, which is like the nut low. So yeah, we definitely want to 3-bet here most of the time against most players, and we get the fold from the good reg and villain flats and off to the flop. So first of all, we need to think about what kind of hands we expect him to open and then flat, and I'd say like suited Broadway cards that are like not ace queen plus, like ace jack, ace 10 suited, king queen suited, king 10 suited, queen jack suited, jack 10 suited. All those hands are probably in the range. Maybe some like suited connectors and probably some pocket pairs that we actually dominate, however much that's actually worth, for whatever that's worth, so suited connectors, pocket pairs, Broadway cards, suited Broadways, maybe some suited aces that are weaker than ace 10. Like we might see ace 5 suited flat here, but I would think if villain's very good and very aggressive, that he might go ahead and come back over the top with a hand like ace 5 suited, so he can have some hands that have a blocker that can 4-bet and then fold to a jam. Yeah, so his range is going to be capped and bound. It's going to be condensed, and it's not polarized. So this is one of the rare situations where we're going to go to the flop as pre-flop raiser, and we're going to be kind of at range parity. Okay, so our range is uncapped, and it's not as bounded. We can have, like, because we're 3-betting a merged range here, like a linear range. It's going to have strong hands all the way down to the weakest hands that we're going to play. And villain here is also flatting a condensed range. So his range is capped and bounded. Ours is not capped and bounded, but they're both linear. They're both kind of merged. And the flop comes ace jack 7. So who's got the range advantage here? Well, first of all, I don't think it's cut and dried. It's like, and that's the first thing you should ask yourself, is just, do I have a major range advantage? So much of a range advantage that I want to bet all of my hands and just make a range bet. I would say not. I would say that our opponent hits this flop often. Like, he really, very rarely is going to whiff this flop. And when he does whiff the flop, the hands that he whiffs the flop with, we have drawing so dead that we would prefer, if we're going to put a bet in here, which I don't think we should, but if we're going to bet, if we bet and he calls, we're dead. But if we check and he bets and we call, at least we have his few bluffs. At least his, like, 6-5 suited that he might occasionally have, or his, like, boy, it's hard for me to even come up with a bluff here. So yeah, I mean, definitely what I'm thinking is check and fold. I think that's the play here. In this hand, the hero does decide to check, and villain checks back, and that's interesting. Okay, so now, before the turn card even comes, we can start to range this villain. So probably he had like a condensed range pre-flop, and then when we check, he checks back on this flop. So what does his range look like? I mean, I think he could have like queens, but the problem with the queens would be he very well and probably, very likely, would have tried to get queens in pre-flop, steal versus re-steal, like late position versus a blind. So the kinds of hands that normally check back as pre-flop raised on a board like this might be pocket queens, pocket kings, jack X, but he's not going to have kings, he's not going to have queens. Occasionally you'll see players check back like ace 2 suited through ace 5 suited if they're pre-flop raiser, if they hit this flop, but he probably doesn't. I mean, he might flat some of that stuff, and he might check it back if he did. But I think that if you just take the two things, number one, he's going to be 4-betting a lot of his ace X pre-flop, and number two, he's probably going to be betting a lot of his ace X on the flop if we check. I think that means he has very little ace X in his range at this point. He gets rid of most of it by flatting pre-flop, and then he gets rid of most of the rest of it by checking the flop. So I think that the most likely thing that we're looking at here is some kind of a draw that's taking a free card, some kind of a Jack X combo, which could be like Queen Jack, Jack 10, King Jack, and you know, like I said, occasionally he'll have a gut shot that checks back. Although I think that once Hero checks, I think the gut shots will actually bet a lot. You know, definitely more than they don't bet. So yeah, he's got we kind of cap our range. Oh, well, that's not exactly true. On the flop, if we're going to check a lot on this board, then I think we're going to want some traps in there too. So if we 3-bet like Ace Jack, I think we can check it. And pocket aces, we can check that. And then we'll also have some hands like pocket kings that we'll check and call. So we're not super capped, but still I think he's going to have some incentive to bet some of his draws, and probably the draws with the lowest amount of, well, with the best blocker situations and highest equity and lowest showdown value. But mainly, I think Homeboy here is going to have a lot of like Jack X. You know, he's going to have a lot of Jack X. He's going to have some pocket tens. He's going to have, you know, Queen Jack, King Jack, and then a handful of gut shots. All right, so this card comes, the King of Spades. Now, what do we do? And I know, like, everyone is used to hearing me say, well, what makes a good bluff? The first thing we need for a good bluff is a bad hand, right? A very low equity hand, or sorry, a very low showdown value hand. The second thing is we want equity when called. So if we don't have showdown value and we do have equity when called, the third thing we want is our opponent to have a weak range or have a fold button, him to be able to make folds, or him to have a lot of hands that are nothing. And here we have a guy that checked back on a flop he probably would have bluffed a lot on. And he's probably got something more often than nothing, and even the nothings that he might have checked back on the flop turned into somethings, like Queen 10 just got there, even if he decided to check that back. And plus, we have pocket eights, so this was the question, like, this guy bets, and my guy was like, I don't understand, like, why is he making this bet, and would you do the same thing? And he's like, I know you probably wouldn't, because pocket eights have showdown value, and your pocket eights have no equity when called, and your opponent probably has a lot of like showdown value type hands, and we're not going to be able to take this down with one bet very often. We're going to, even if we run into like King Queen here, which will happen a lot, I think, if he has King Queen, like, you know, King Queen of Hearts or King Queen of Diamonds, and he checked back flop, he's not going to fold this when we fire one shot. Even pocket tens is likely to peel us. We're not going to get value from second best hands. Those would have probably bet the flop if he just had air, and they're not going to call now anyway. And if they raise, we can't call. So what on earth are we doing here? Why would this make sense? Okay, so here's the thing, guys. Yes, in a perfect world, in a perfect situation, the perfect bluff is a bluff that has good equity when called and bad showdown value. And our opponent would have a range that has a lot of air in it. But so in this situation, with any kind of reads about our opponent at all, if we think he's kind of sticky, if we don't think he's very good, if we don't feel a need to be at all balanced, then I do think we can just check and hope that we get some kind of weird check back with air and win at showdown, or that villain's got like 7x or pocket sixes or pocket fives, and we just hit the 8 and we're able to value bet the river. Hopefully those things happen. Most of the time they're not going to, and I can definitely see a world where we're going to check and fold, because this might be a better hand to check and fold with than a lot of hands, right? Because it only, I want to say this, there's only showdown value in that it actually is a pair. Like, it doesn't beat any of our, it doesn't have that much showdown value. Like, how good are we doing against even a random hand
with pocket eights on ace jack 7 ace jack 7 king. Like, how good are we doing against just any two cards? Not great, right? So how good are we doing against the range that raises pre-flop and calls a 3-bet? Do we really have showdown value with our pocket eights? I would say we don't. I would say that our showdown value is so minuscule that if we want to be playing something like a balanced strategy, it's going to be a fine hand to turn into a bluff. It's not perfect. It doesn't have no showdown value, and it doesn't have good equity when called. But look at your overall range here. If you're ever going to bluff this spot, if you're ever going to fire the turn as a bluff, what hand are you going to use to do it with? Like, what hands do you even have in your range that are worse than pocket eights? Like, maybe sixes? I mean, I guess you can have lower pairs, but, I mean, think of all of your Broadway hands that you 3-bet are better than eights. Your pocket sevens even are better than eights. Your pocket nines, tens. I mean, you are nearly at the bottom of your range here. And in fact, it could be that if you had a hand like pocket fives, it's just hopeless on the flop, that you would just c-bet the flop. You would just turn that hand into a bluff on the flop. So this might be one of the very worst hands. It could potentially be the worst hand in your range. Like, maybe you c-bet sixes on the flop. I wouldn't think that would be a terrible play. I mean, they don't have any real value anyway. You know, they're not even beating the 7x. Let's just turn them into a bluff. We're going to have some hands that want to go. We're going to want to have some hands that fire one shell on the flop and then shut down as a bluff. And we're kind of low on bluffs. Like, all of our hands have some little something going for them, whether that be a pair or a draw or, you know, two pair or a set. Yeah, so I don't think that this bet is as different from the way that I play poker as this student, kind of ex-student, thought. Like, he thought that I would think this is a ridiculous bet. And I don't think it's ridiculous. I think very often we can just check and fold here, and if it goes check-check, then maybe we win occasionally at showdown. And if it goes check and then he bets, he's probably not bluffing. I mean, he's not bluffing enough for us to make the call. But if we want to be anything like balanced, and if we want to actually attack the capped range, and that's the thing, right? When the guy checks back on the flop, so he just called pre-flop, he checks back on the flop, he does have a bound range. Like, maybe he doesn't c-bet queen 10 on the flop, so maybe he can have some straights, but I don't think he's got that many, because he may fold queen 10 pre-flop, although he probably flats it. He might even come over the top with it, although he probably flats it. And then when we check on the flop, if he's going to stab with anything, I would think he would stab queen 10. So maybe he gets to this turn with very few, but just a couple of straights. But other than that, he's got like a very capped range. You know, I guess he can try to have slow played kings pre-flop and just banked a set on the turn, I guess, some of the time. Maybe he flats ace. In any case, the vast majority of his range is going to be like jack X, pocket nines, 7x, you know, that kind of thing. Maybe even, like I said, he can occasionally check back a weak ace, but how much is he going to like calling down with a weak ace? So if we want to put pressure on this capped range, if we want to attack the capped range, and if we want any semblance of balance, we have to have some bluffs. What bluffs do we have? If we're not betting eights as a bluff, what bluff are we betting? Like all of our king X, all of our jack X, all of our ace X, our queen 10, all of these things that we would 3-bet pre-flop, probably either c-bet the flop, and we didn't do that, so we don't have those hands, or they're actually decent hands that can check and call, or even value hands that can bet now, like king jack, right? Okay, so I understand that if you use like the Navanad strategy, the way to think about framing your hand out, this hand looks like it is at the middle of your range. It's like a showdown value type hand, like a bluff catcher, and we should be checking, either checking and calling or checking and folding, but we shouldn't be bluffing because it kind of looks like it's in the middle-ish of our range, and also it doesn't have good equity when called, and it does have good showdown value, but actually it doesn't have good showdown value, and it is at the bottom of our range. And yeah, we don't have the equity when called, but such is life. We just don't have many good options. We do have the 8 of spades blocker, and we do have the 8 for straights blocker. It's not nothing. You know, it can help us on some rivers to make some better bluffs. And the other thing my guy said is, like, he said, I know that if you're betting this turn, you are definitely betting the river because you know we're not going to get him to fold very often with a single shot. And that part is true enough. Like, fair enough. There might be some river cards, there will be some river cards that talk me out of it, where I'll bet turn planning on betting river, but then kind of say, well, that's the wrong river to do it, I just have to give up. And what better hand to give up with, you know, that kind of thing. But yeah, he was right about that. If we're going to bet the turn, I think we should be planning on betting the river, because our opponent doesn't just have a capped range. Our opponent has a capped and bounded range. It's mostly capped, but it's almost completely bounded. If we think he's like ever bluffing his air on the flop after the pre-flop raiser checks to him and he's in position on a board that looks good for his range, which I would say almost every decent player is going to do that, then we have to imagine that he didn't get to the turn with nothing, and even some of his nothings were like king-queen, right? king-10, that now picked up a something, right? So those hands are not going to fold to one bet. So I think the worst thing we could do is bet one time and then shut down. Again, sometimes it's going to happen, but we don't want that to happen. So we bet, he does call, which should be no surprise at all, and we catch the 9 of spades. Okay, so this is kind of like the way I look at this is about it's one of the best cards we could hope for a triple barrel. All of a sudden, our blockers are completely relevant. You know, like the 8 being an 8 just became relevant. You know, we block straights. We could potentially have a hand like, I don't know, 7x of spades that, like maybe, what, 10-7 of spades, or 7-6 of spades, maybe 3 bets pre-flop, and then we have the 7, so we check for showdown value on the flop. He checks back, we pick up the flush draw, we decide to go for the bet. We can have just some, well, whether or not, and I think that is believable, whether or not we would actually play it that way, but the main thing is that we take hands like flushes and we remove some of the flush draws that our opponent could have picked up on the, like if he was just giving up with some flush draw on the flop and then picks, or with some 3 flush, some 2 spade combination on the flop, but he picked up another spade on the turn and we bet he exactly called, that's bad for us. But just the fact that we have the 8 of spades makes it just a little bit less likely, and that same thing applies to all of his straight draws that probably, I mean, there's not many of them, but there's more than 0. So the 7-9 jack, the 7-9 jack means that some combination of 8 and another card makes a straight, so we've got that blocker, and we've got the 8 of spades blocker. We are at the, like, pretty much the bottom of our range, and we already knew that if we were going to bet the turn, that we should bet the river, because we want to get rid of king-queen. If he flats pocket queens pre-flop, we want to get rid of pocket 10s. Now pocket 9s just got there. But we're targeting hands like king 10, king queen, and jack X primarily, or like strangely weirdly played pocket queens, or somewhat strange ace, like ace rag combos like the ace 2 of diamonds, ace 5 of diamonds. I mean, I'm not going to say it's unimaginably bad. I could see myself taking that line against a small blinds 3-betting range, like especially if I don't know if the small blind is 3-betting all of their hands, or if I don't know if they're polarized, or if I don't know if they're merged. I might just think like pre-flop, we're going back to pre-flop, I might just think like, well, ace 5 suited is a pretty decent hand, and I don't really know what kind of range I want to have against this guy's 3-bets yet, because I don't know if he's polar or merged or depolarized, or if he's, I don't know what he's doing. So maybe I would just say like ace 2 suited or ace 5 suited is just too good of a hand to fold, and I don't want to waste it on bluffing him. So I might just flat, and if I did flat something like the ace 2 of diamonds, or the ace 5 of spades, Bad example. Let's say the ace-5 of diamonds, so I get to the flop with an ace and a deuce, and especially if I also have like backdoor flush draw. If he checks, if pre-flop raiser checks to me, I may well check back there. So I don't think it would be ridiculous, and I don't think there's any way ace-2 through ace-5 can call here. I mean, we already said the guy's pretty decent at poker. He'd have to be a major toolbox to make that call now. We bet the turn. We got a really good card to bet the river with. We weren't planning on getting a lot of folds on the turn, and we knew that we were kind of making a reach to turn this hand into a bluff. We must have thought that we had a pretty good idea of how our opponent played, that he had a mostly capped range, but that was, I mean, almost certainly bounded pretty high. And so we just have to go for the barrel here. And in game, or in the hand, the hero does barrel the size of the pot, and villain does fold. And I think that that all makes perfect sense. But the kind of the real point here, I also understand why somebody who's been under my tutelage, so to speak, and watched my videos would think that I'd have a big problem with this hand. But it's showdown value is not some intrinsic thing that your hand either has or does not have. So we could say pocket eights have showdown value, but how much showdown value do they have on ace, jack, 7, king, 9? Not very much, right? So it doesn't have that much showdown value. It doesn't have much to speak of. And yes, we do want to have equity when called. The first thing we need to make a good bluff is a bad hand. And is pocket eights bad enough? Well, it depends on the board. But I'd say when it's ace, jack, 7, king, yeah, pocket eights is a pretty bad frickin' hand, especially if you're the 3-better. Like, we 3-bet pre-flop. What worse hands do we have? If we stab our baby pairs on the flop, which I think would make sense, and we just check, like, you know, eights, well, everything I just said. But yeah, so I do think this is a fine way to play a hand. I think it's probably pretty close to it seems like the person that made this, took this line, probably was thinking in game theory optimal type ways, and wasn't trying to make. I mean, it seems like something that I haven't checked it, but it seems like something that Pio Solver would probably agree with at least some of the time. I think yeah. So I guess that's what I wanted to say. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you'd like to have something like this done for you, you can send me your questions, send me your hands, tell me, you know, kind of what you're interested in. Give me your email address or your phone number. I'll text you. I guess I'd have your email address if you emailed me. Or you can leave it in the comments here and I'll take a look at it. But I think what I'm planning on doing is something like this. Like, if you want me to spend an hour going through your stuff, or watch an hour of you playing and taking notes and all of that. You know, normally I would charge $40 an hour for lessons, but because I could kind of do that on my own time and then put the video together on my own time, I think the idea would be if I spend an hour going through your stuff and then make an hour or like a hour plus video, that we just do that for $40. And if you know, if we could be kind of easy on time, you know, like no real strict, like this has to be in a week. I mean, a week probably I would do, but I guess depending on the response. But it'll all be, we can talk it all out. We can negotiate it all out. You tell me what you're comfortable with, and we can make it work. I'm not in this for the money, guys. I just enjoy what I do. But in order to justify the time away from family, I have to get paid, like at least on par with what I make in the real world, right? At least something in that ballpark. So, yeah, like something in the $40 ballpark. Or if I was going to be able to use it as a YouTube video and then put it on as like advertisement and to kind of make the channel a little bit more diverse and reach more people with it, if you give me the go-ahead to use the video for a YouTube video, then we could even get you down to a lower price. And that way you could ask your specific questions and I could do a specific video on it and you could get it done for almost nothing, you know? Like maybe 25 bucks, something like that, you know? Like no big deal. So hopefully that appeals to some people, and if you've thought about coaching and you just don't know if you can afford it, well, coaching does not get more affordable than that. It is not gonna happen. You know, that's it. That's the nut low price. Until next time, guys. Namaste, homies. Word to your mothers. East side till I die. All of that and good. Quote LUCK, end quote. Namaste, bitches.